Welcome, everybody, to the second FGG talk show, Participation and Inclusion Matters. I am your host. My name is Shiv Paul, and I am one of the vice presidents of external relations for the Federation of Gay Games. And if anyone out there listening does not know what the Federation or the Gay Games is, the Gay Games is probably at this point the world's largest sports and culture event put on by LGBTQ people that is open to all. So it really, truly democratizes sport and culture in a way that many, many other events don't. So very excited to be part of that organization. And I'm really excited for this show today for the next half an hour, where we are talking about us entering a year of reliving. And I'm super excited to have a really fabulous, fantastic group of women on this panel discussion today. And I'm going to do some introductions and we will dive straight into what I hope will be a very fascinating topic. First of all, we have Chloe Davies. Chloe is a proud bisexual woman, a mother of two, a creative, global inclusion and belonging consultant, a chef, and an entrepreneur. Chloe volunteers with UK Black Pride as the head of finance and governance, and she is the community lead for the London Queer Fashion Show, an annual showcase of fashion, identity, and expression. And she is a trustee for the London LGBTQ plus community centre, and she describes herself, and I particularly love this, as a mental health survivor. Welcome, Chloe. Very excited for you to be here.
Thank you for having
Um,
me.
Next, we have Joanie Evans, and Joanie is the co-president of the Federation of Gay Games. She's based in London, and Joanie originally hails from Birmingham. Her sport is football, and her first team actually was Hackney Women's Football Club, which was the first team in Europe. She's been to 7 gay games, 2 as co-president, and she has been the FGG co-president since 2013. And so in many ways, for the purposes of this call, Joanie is my boss, which, very exciting. It's nice to have your boss on a panel discussion in that way. And last but not least, we have Renee Tirado, and I'm extremely proud to call Renee a good friend of mine. Renee trained as a lawyer, and she's been working in the diversity and inclusion space for more than a decade at this point. And I first met Renee back in 2014. I had made a short documentary film called Queens at Court, which was about LGBT amateur tennis players. And I got connected to the United States Tennis Association, and they decided to take that on and use it as part of their diversity outreach programs. And Renee was my first point of contact at the STA. Immediately felt a vibe and a connection. But then I don't know if it was me or if it was the way that I dressed or something I said. She very quickly left that position before we even got the tour on the road. But she went on to more fabulous things that awaited her, including becoming the head of diversity and inclusion at Major League Baseball, and then going to Gucci as the global chief of diversity. And now she is at hugely successful startup Harry's that is big conquering the market. So I'm truly humbled to be in the presence of such D&I heavyweights and just very powerful, strong women on this panel. So all I was inspired to do a show around us entering this year of reliving, actually by you, Chloe, because I had facilitated a panel discussion on Ida Hobbit, the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia for UK athletics. And Chloe was on that panel with a bunch of other really great people. And I think you had mentioned that phrase that we are, May 25th saw the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And there is now, for the next year, we are going to be as as the world reliving everything that has just gone before in the past 12 months or more. And I found that really, really fascinating because it really spurred me to think about what are industries and organizations doing, including sports organizations, to support people through the management of I think what is going to be a fairly harrowing year. It's not that there was just pandemic and COVID, or George Floyd's murder. That certainly sparked a massive movement, which has, a global lens. But many, many other atrocities, which I think have been highlighted over the past sort of 12 to 18 months. And so I found that really, really fascinating. Um, Chloe, I want to go to you first, since, this was a phrase I stole from you, right, for the title of this show. But you obviously have been thinking about that a lot. And this is particularly why I love in your bio, you call yourself a mental health survivor. Just when you think about the next 12 months that we have ahead of us, what comes to your mind? What are you thinking about in terms of what can people expect, and how can they be supported in what's coming?
Absolutely. So now we're joined by my other son, who's just climbed through the window from outside. I think the reason why I say reliving is because however we coped last year, in whichever facet, and a lot of that was online, we are constantly being reminded of the place that we were in, whether it's, a Facebook memory or on this day last year. And so, as much as I talked about at that time, I want to get back to living. I actually want to no longer just survive. I want to thrive. But the reliving part is so important, because even if we don't want to, we're going back to that place that we were a year ago. We're going back to those thoughts and feelings. And in some aspects, we're also asking ourselves the question again, what's changed? And when much hasn't changed, or the needle has moved forward, but in the ways that it's moved, it's also then adding on further weights. When we look to where we are today and some of the things that have been going on, it's even worse in some aspects, because, when we look at those who are being convicted during, the trials, and then many trials that are coming, we relive what happens time and time again. And so it's really now about actually making a conscious effort to create a space where we can talk about it openly, we can talk about how it affects us, but also to be angry about it, because I'll be really honest, I'm still angry. I am a mother, I'm the mother of sons. So on all sides, even if I try to separate myself from it, I really can't, because the reality is the world has not changed enough that one day that might not be my children, but also that I might be in the situation where, the young woman who actually was the one brave enough to stand there and show love and support for Joy, to make sure that nobody forgot what happened and to record it. We also need to think about the impact of those when the change needs to happen, but also as the change makers, what impact that has on you too. And that comes at all levels. So for me, the reliving part is incredibly important, because it needs to be taken note in so many different ways, because it has such an impact on everything that we do as people, and especially Black people and people of color.
Yeah, no, those are really great points, and it's an interesting, I don't even know what the word is, but situation to be in, right? Because certainly we don't want to forget, right? We don't want to forget anything that has happened. And social media actually would never let us anyway. This is out there. It's going to be, every year. But at the same time, even that footage of George Floyd's murder, I mean, it's very harrowing. I mean, this is very sort of explicit material that is out in the public domain. Renee, I want to come to you, because there is this sort of I want to see if I can try to make this connection, but you having worked in sort of a variety of mediums, but primarily in sports, right? Sport obviously has a responsibility to support the mental health of its athletes and things like that. And you think about Major League Baseball, what kinds of things would that organization do, not just to support the mental health of athletes as they're on this journey, right, in terms of what they're doing in the sports arena, but would they consider doing things to support their athletes from these types of things that are happening in the world as well?
Yeah, I think actually the sports leagues do have the capacity to provide the resources. I think the bigger challenge, quite frankly, especially, and this ties well to what we've seen, and we've talked a little bit about with what's happened to Naomi. Right now, most global sports are so male dominated, And there is still stigma with men, you know, acknowledging their mental health challenges, their fatigue, in addition, compounded by the fact that you are this role model on this huge stage and you have these contracts that have these morals clauses. Like, there's a lot of layers to this. So I think the leagues would absolutely respond to it very, very quickly, but there would have to be a collective voice of athletes, and unfortunately, in particular, male athletes, because of what we've seen. Like, what to me, Naomi Osaka's been bullied, you know, basically by the federation. Like, she was shamed and bullied. I don't know if it would have happened the same way if it were male athletes, if it was a Federer or, you know, a Rafa that said, you know what, I'm not doing well here. And I think that voice becomes a larger collective, particularly of male athletes that come forward and say, you know, this is a struggle and we need resources. The fact of the matter is the leagues will respond. I would like to believe most of them will respond and would respond well. For moral reasons, from a values perspective, but the reality is they'll also respond from an economic perspective, you know, and until that, we have to tie this back to that part, unfortunately. You know, when we see that happens, that's when you'll see the shift. I will tell you this, I can tell you from the US side, when the professional sports at this side of the pond, those resources are available. And the problem is that they're not readily used because of the broader global stigma around addressing and owning mental health challenges. So I think there's a couple of layers here. We have to normalize this conversation. We have to be on social media, hashtag, because that is lovely, but it's gone because of the volume of content coming in at any given time. This we have to normalize as part of our everyday wellness vernacular, the same way we talk about heart and annual physicals and, you know, annual OBGYN and breast exams. We have to put this into that same scope of conversation. And then two, you have to have a legitimate volume, or at least I won't say legitimate, because I think they're already there. I think you have to have create an environment of safety for these athletes to come forward and be, you know, say it's okay to say it. And then after that, I think you'll see a big shift. And I think it'll also impact the broader culture as well. As we know, athletes have a huge amount of influence on the behavior of other people, even not, you know, non-athletes and fans alike. So I think that's the potential there. But quite frankly, if it's the Naomis of the world, you know, or LGBTQIA community that continues to be the primary voice around this, I think it will continue to be a challenge to get the resources and the validation that it needs. And it's going to require, in order to prompt a bigger shift overall in sports, and broader shift in sports, but more broadly in general as a cultural shift.
There's so many kind of like juicy things that you said in there, and I think one of them is really, you know, society's view of masculinity, right? You know, and you're right, you know, men don't still want to talk about mental health or their own struggles and things like that, and the ones that do, you know, I mean, I can think of Prince Harry off the top of my head because they just had a baby and he's been quite open about that, but that hasn't necessarily been that well received. Like, it feels like there's always something else that they're looking to attack somebody for that. And in case anybody listening doesn't know about the Naomi Osaka reference that Renee made, Naomi obviously is one of the world's top tennis players, decided that she did not want to do any press at the French Open. And I think, I don't know if she said this originally, but I think then later said the reason was she found it provoked quite a lot of anxiety in her. And to protect her own mental health, she wanted to kind of, you know, remove herself from that kind of negativity, and really was not well supported by the tennis associations. There was a statement signed by the 4 Grand Slams that basically said she's got contractual obligations, and that if she continued to do this, she would be fined, right? So it was kind of being bullied or threatened. Whereas I find
she received an incredibly high fine,
Right.
And I thought, what I also thought was extraordinarily interesting. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I want to make sure that the audience has the context as well. Not only did she provoke the anxiety, she tied it back to the business case, right? Because she said,
Yeah.
this impacts my play.
Yeah.
Like it impacts my play, and they brushed that aside.
Yeah.
Completely.
Yeah. That's what was, and I'm glad that you made that point. But there are so many different fascinating sort of aspects to that. As we know, Roger just pulled out, yesterday from the French Open after winning his match, citing, he had to listen to his body. So he's protecting his physical wellness. And quite candidly, I think he would own up to this too, because he wants to win more Grand Slams. His best chance is probably Wimbledon, and he's saving himself for that. And that's totally fine. No one has really said anything about that. They're like, it's okay. But Naomi wanting to sort of protect her mental health, wellness, has kind of been met with a bit of ridicule and that kind of thing. And, there has to be a lot of kind of sexism in play there. I mean, Joanie, I want to come to you because you're the only sort of athlete on the call, right? And no disrespect to my other guests, but I was really, not even myself, right? At this point, my tennis game is quite poor. But you as a footballer, right, in very traditionally male-dominated sport,
Yeah.
have you seen changes over the years? I know that there are some sort of like global explicit changes around the way that women's football is perceived, but what has been your own experience over the years in terms of whether that needle has moved in terms of that sort of sexism realm?
Okay, where do I start? I think the thing is that the thing is, it's how women's football has grown over the past few years has been like enormous. It should have got there a lot longer ago, because it's as if everybody's just realised that women can play as well. I've been a proper player of women's football since I was 25, so that's like half a century. But in terms of that, it's the changes that I've seen is whereby even as a grassroots sport, you couldn't even get a mention anywhere. In terms of where you could find women's sport to watch, if you didn't go and see it in person, you wouldn't find it on TV. Even when England was playing, you wasn't even seeing the England women's being shown on TV. You'd have to scroll every channel and probably find it on BBC Wales at 12 o'clock at night. So it was those sort of things. And now there's money going into it, but I don't think the women's game has as much discrimination in it now, because all of the things that the men have to deal with, women don't. They don't have to deal with lesbians playing the sport, because people know lesbians play. It's quite open about, players who've got partners. That is not the issue. But what it does is that once one level of issue is dealt with, it just brings up another issue. So there's an issue about women not being paid the same. I very much worry that with the growth of women's football as it is, that grassroots football will be forgotten about, because I very much noticed that there isn't a lot of players of colour that play for the country or play for any of the top teams. Why is that not happening? So I'm very worried that the game will go so fast that how it started and where the grassroots is not going to be recognised. And I feel that as an adult who missed out on all of the joys of playing the game and what is happening now, is that I'd hate for any young girl coming up who wouldn't have all of the opportunity to play the game. So that's what I'd be worried about, because there's not a level playing field on that scale.
Yeah. Something that sorry, you finish and then I'll go.
No, because the only thing that I see that's made a difference in football as a sport is the way that the UK players still take the knee. It's very evident they've been playing friendlies in Europe, and teams in Europe are not taking the knee. But one of the things is, like, I sort of feel that it's a good thing that our players are still holding on to that, because it does have a different effect somewhere else. It's that whether we get used to it, it's like Zaha is no longer taking the knee, but that in itself hasn't made a different statement anywhere else. So it's do one thing and keep doing it with the hope that it's going to make change along the line, or there needs to be something else, I feel, that needs to be going along with the knee. So yeah.
I wanna there is something about mental health, but I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because I think what you just said was really interesting. And I want to open this up to you, Renee, and to you, Chloe, as well. But what would that look like? What Joanie's saying, like what should that look like? You know, sport has always wanted to sort of be you know, apolitical. It never really has been, you know, particularly the world that we're living now, you know, or actually with anything that you're doing, it's very difficult to separate politics from everything else that's happening in your life. It's almost impossible. So I'm interested to know, you know, and I'm huge on, I think, you know, players taking the knee and things like that. One, it does show a statement that is quite positive for younger players coming up, right? Because it's showing a reinforcement of values and respect and those sorts of things that are important to sport anyway, but it's showing it in an active way. But I'm interested to the three of you, if you had your way, what would you like to see the sports industry or different sports organizations doing more of to support these different communities, martial arts communities that are taking the brunt of these kinds of attacks, or even to have more of a political voice than they perhaps have had in the past?
Okay. I think it's important to see what teams are doing in terms of what's happening within their own communities, because it's the local communities around the areas of the teams. I mean, I live quite close to Arsenal, although I'm a Leeds United supporter. But in terms of that, I sort of know that for Arsenal as a club, there's a lot of stuff within the community. And that in itself is an opportunity for clubs to do more about educating their supporters about how they should be behaving, and in terms of there should be more things done where clubs have statements around what they're going to do around homophobia, racism, sexism, all of those isms. But I think it needs to have a statement that comes from the club that they won't tolerate those things. So at the moment, I don't think there is a general statement that any club will say. They'll say on certain levels that they don't agree with certain things, but I don't think they've actually put those words down anywhere to actually act on it. So whereas within the federation, our thing is participation, inclusion, and personal best, and we do everything to make sure that every aspect of somebody's sporting ability is catered for. That it doesn't happen in every level of sport. So what are they doing about that? And it's not just football, it's about any governing body. It's about ensuring that every aspect of the person who's participating is dealt with, and that would include knowing if they're a woman around what issues that may come for them, if they're a person of color, what issue may come up for them. Like, we have procedures around most things that blow your head off within the federation that we wish that other places take those things on, but who's going to hear that? And I think that it is very much because it comes from a male dominated side. Until obviously we probably get a sports person who's probably no longer playing their sport will come out and say that I've dealt with mental illness, and then there'll be a whole foray of anything. But the sports people, the ones that are out there that are role models, have got much more responsibilities that they're not making use of at the moment.
I jump in here for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
Just wanted to say I don't disagree with anything that Joanie said. I think that was 100% valid. I also think it's very, very. It's a question of, like, do you go and try to be a thought leader in the community? Sorry, I'm in New York City, as you can hear from the background. So this welcome to New York, everyone. But I did want to say, I think it's important that when you want to say, like, what else can the sports industry and the league do, and how to bring it to your community and provide these spaces, you have to kind of make sure your own house is in order before you try to go forward and try to lead on the conversation. Yeah. And I think so many of our leagues and our individual clubs and and the businesses related to sports, they haven't even done a good job with this internally. So before you can actually come out, because they could make statements, right? But then it becomes a PR and marketing campaign, and it's performative.
Disingenuous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It doesn't become a genuine initiative or investment to change the thinking and to be more inclusive and to allow for more resources around vulnerability. So I think 100%, I think these leagues and these clubs and individual clubs, et cetera, can do more. But I think a big part of it is start with the person in the mirror, right? And kind of like, well, what does our house look like? What do we have to clean up? Because I think it's infinitely more impactful before you go to the community to say, we looked at ourselves, we've done XYZ, we understand we are on a long haul journey, but just so you know, this is where we started and we want to bring you along with us. So, versus coming out and just saying, this is what you should do and we're going to let you do that. I don't think it would be as effective or impactful.
100%. No, I agree with you 100% there. And Chloe, we want to come with you, but surely there are organizations that are doing things well, right? And we have seen, in some instances, for example, in the States, with different states that want to impose legislations that would sort of not even imply actually, that would restrict voters' abilities to vote easily and things like that in elections. And there have been sports organizations that have, pulled their games out of those states, right? Because they don't want to be seen to support kind of legislation. So, with those organizations that are doing those types of things, and let's assume that perhaps their house is in better order than some others, I guess my questions are, would we expect them to do more? Like, are they the leaders then that we should be looking to in the sports industry, who we want to be convening other sort of sports leagues or organizations to encourage them to do the same? Or well, I guess, or not, right? Or do we just leave all of these different sports organizations to their own devices?
I don't think it's about leaving to their own devices, but I think it's kind of taking apart from what Joanie and Renee have been saying, which is, like, talk is cheap. I grew up hearing that one a lot. So especially coming back to the part about the reliving, for the next few weeks, we are going to relive the Black Square debacle and businesses that came out and said, we are here for Black people, we are here for Black rights in our organizations. And again, coming back to that part that I said at the beginning, what has changed? Not much has changed. So when we ask about, okay, so sorry, child. We ask about what are people doing, and do people have more of a responsibility? I would say absolutely, because when we're talking about people taking a knee, Colin Kaepernick has still not got a team and he is still persecuted. And the reason that we have that conversation is because of one man's struggles, that he said, I do not want this for everybody else. I'm going to put it on a global stage, and still he's being persecuted for it. So the real conversations that need to be happening have been moved off for something else, but the actual heart of the issue hasn't been dealt with. So I think it comes back to, in all of this, yes, the conversations need to happen at all times. That's where you get the visibility of it. The education is inherent, and that's what Renee's saying, is like, sort your own house out. But ultimately, on both sides, for me, it's the accountability, because I'm not going to forget that you said it. And so I'm going to come back and keep asking you, what have you done? Where have you actually made that fundamental change? And when you speak it and you put it down on a piece of paper, who is actually then holding you account to make sure the work is happening? Because we are in abundance in all of these leagues, all of these games, in all of these sports. You will see us, you'll see people of color, you'll see people of difference. And so even when I was just thinking about the mental health thing, Naomi has come out and she said, and the thing that keeps running through my head is, at what cost? At what cost is it the real fundamental change going to happen? Because if she did do it, let's just say, for instance, she did say that she was going to take part in, the French Open, and she burnt out, even though she's verbalized what's wrong with her, I can guarantee you that no one's actually going to take care of her mental health. What they'll say was that she wasn't fit enough or she's not capable enough. So at what cost is it going to come for people to tell the truth and be open about their struggles, for the federations, for the leagues to actually take real note and do that fundamental change? You know, I dread to think what Colin has been through, being a change maker, but also what impact it's had on his mental health. I think so far, I just Googled, there have been seven players who've come out around the world to say, I'm struggling with mental health. We're talking Mike Phelps, Ronda Rousey, you know, people who, seven.
Yeah.
Most of those are in the US. So,
Yeah.
you know, at what cost is it to other players who will still continue to put themselves in these situations where they are fighting for country and fighting for their states where they come from, for that pride, but also are suffering at the same time? And how do we support that? So I think we have to have these conversations at all times. It's not about what's not happening and what's not going. It's for those who aren't here or for those who can't speak. This is the work that continues to be done.
Yeah, and I think things like this are opportunities for organizations and federations to you know, to use Renee's words, to kind of look at their own house and clean up, right? You know, I think about let's face it, if you are an athlete, a professional athlete, every single person who's been a professional athlete that is going to suffer from these kinds of issues, right? No one's talking about it necessarily, but it's going to happen. It's part of the nature of that profession, and particularly sports where you have a lot of young people who then at a certain young age decide to go professional. There has to be more support that. Like I think of, sticking on the French Open, Iga Swiatek, right, the defending champion, and she has been quite methodical about her career, and you know, herself, I think at 14, 15, went to her parents and said, I want a sports psychologist. I want to start working with a psychologist at like 14 or 15 years old. So, you know, obviously understanding that she needed those sorts of foundational pillars in order to drive towards a success that she wants. But you know, one of the things that's really interesting about this, because we talk about education, I think a lot of the reason this is not happening is there's a lot of ignorance out there. And for me, what surfaced with what happened with Naomi is quite, I think this is not really a surprise, but still it was sort of quite shocking. And I know that sounds contradictory, were people's lack of understanding about mental health issues. And I'm thinking about the French Tennis Federation president, Gilles Moreton, who basically, in his very short statement, said that you know, he wished her the quickest possible recovery. You know, as if she had flu and you know, soon she would be back on court and that kind of thing. Now, there have been other players actually. I can think of several years ago when Rafa went through kind of a bit of a weird spell, and he was fairly honest about it, where he said, I don't have confidence. I feel afraid to hit my forehand when I'm on court. Don't really know what's going on. I kind of just have to work through it. But it was never, no one really talked about it then, even. I mean, surely at that point they could have said, well, actually, what is contributing to that? But I think people just felt like, well, that's kind of his own issue, and that's something that he just has to sort out himself. And it's nothing that we are doing in terms of the business of the sport that's contributing to that. But I'm interested to know, and perhaps Chloe, I'll come to you first. People's understanding of mental health. Have you even seen that change? Because I feel like that's one of the areas that people don't fully. I bet we all, right, at some point in our lives have suffered that, whether we call it that or not. But have you seen any kind of change or movement in the understanding of that?
I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that everyone knows what mental health stands for. But actually, if we're really going to look at this through an intersectional lens, then no, because actually people will make the assumption that mental health, again, like, you know, is an illness that you can be cured from. Like, as I say, that's why I say I'm a mental health survivor, because it lives with me. I don't live with it. So I choose to pursue and carry on. And every single person will have a different way of how they view their mental health. And so even if, like, you know, just shortly we stick with tennis, I think back to Djokovic when he had his spell and he said, I'm not feeling it. I think back to Andy Murray when Andy Murray was struggling, and he was probably the most open, at least here in the UK, of, you know, I'm struggling, the impact of this. I don't want to let my team down. I also don't want to let myself down. I don't feel it in myself right now and I'm not sure what to do. But even if we go even far, far, my mum loves tennis, so this is why all the tennis noise is coming out. But if we think back to like Andre Agassi, there was a period where Andre Agassi was like, it's not here. And so again, it's the conversation of moving forward about what mental health really means. And I think that, you know, there've been amazing initiatives like Heads Together that's really trying to think about mental health in the mainstream. But again, it's the responsibility, just like, you know, for health and wealth, it's the responsibility of the teams and the federation to put it as a priority, which I had hoped, I'll be really honest, they would do coming out of 2020, for the impact of everyone being in their homes, and the way that we've trained as athletes has completely changed. But they would think about well-being as a priority. But again, unfortunately, in the world of sport, and I think this is where the journey is, again, so much further to be had, they're too reactive and not proactive. So it's only when something devastating happens that's where initiatives really start to take root and change really starts to happen. So that's why I say, at what cost? At what cost is it to loss of life, or to someone leaving the game forever because they don't want to be that voice? That's when people really take note. And that's the part that is so important to keep trying to change now. Because, you know, we've lost too many. We look at football, we look at Justin Fashioney, we look, you know, there are too many people that, if they had the opportunity and the space to say, I don't feel at my best, also because of the pressure that this sport puts on me and I need some help, and what's there and what's available, I think should we be having a very different conversation. And I think for me, that, oh, Renee's like, you know, for me, that, and it might be different in the US than it is in the UK, but, you know, when I look at like the Raheem Sterlings and others who have stepped out into the spotlight for the betterment of people, and the way that they're treated, not even just by society, but by their sport and the lack thereof, that they've been open in saying it's been their own individual communities that have uplifted and held them, and not the people who pay them or the money by which they earn. That for me shows that there's still so much work to do.
Because that is the crux of it. Because what I'm getting is that it's not so much the person playing the sport, it's the sport. So as long as the sport is doing well, then how they get there is not important. But I think that what sport needs to do is look back at how are they going to make the people who play the game whole, so that they play better. It's coming from the wrong thing, is that they do best at their sport, so that's all they need to know. Whether they're struggling or not is not an issue. But if we help people more about helping with people's well-being as a whole, then I think we'd have been a better situation, because I think everybody suffers with mental health. It's all different levels of mental health. But if we don't even tackle that alone, to say, right, we're all starting at the same point, but we may all finish at a different end. But how do we make sure that everybody comes along at the same time? That the opportunities that are always there, and it shouldn't be seen as a stigma. It shouldn't be seen as a stigma if you have a mental health issue, because it doesn't stop you from, most of them don't stop you getting up in the morning or performing or doing any of the things that you do. And it may, for some people, give them the strive to do better, because either they're masking it, or they want to show people that because you've got something different, it doesn't make you enable. So in terms of that, I know that there's been quite a few things come out here in the UK in terms of tackling people's mental health, but little bits of it being this area or that area or the other area. But I think that as a country or a world as itself, everybody has mental health issues, but it's just not being seen as something that everybody has to deal with, and how we can incorporate that with the things that we do. It should be just as easy as you get up and make yourself a cup of tea. It should be easier, that and not seen as this dark thing or this dark place where people go. You know, in terms of when you're constantly being abused or harassed in certain ways, that's going to give you a different level of mental health. So it's trying to take some of those things out of the equation to make it a little bit easier. Sorry.
Renee, yes.
I'm sorry. I thought you were done, Joanie. I apologize. I didn't.
No, I'm finished. No. Now I have. I could keep talking. So I'll stop.
I was just hearing some things, and I just wanted to also like point out like the nuance of even the language around mental health, because to Chloe's point, like we're talking about decades of athletes and mostly male athletes saying this all along, but Naomi and then namely a few of this year market athletes actually labeling it and talking about it for what it is. But even Shiv, you were like, Rafa was talking about his confidence, and a couple of years ago, you're talking about, I'm just not feeling it. The fact that we're not even, there's no universal language that we're empowering to like for people to talk around this, I think is very, as I was listening, I was like, there it is. Like none of the men none of the athletes that Chloe just talked about ever said, I'm having a mental health issue. Even the fact that we have sports psychologists, psychology. Your client is in the sports industry dealing with a different challenge, but we had to label it sports psychology to tie it to something a little bit more comfortable, for us. And I think therein lies part of the problem, right? And part of the subtext around this and the hypermasculinity around sports that doesn't allow for the worst words you could ever say in sports, which is vulnerability. Right? And there it is. And until we even start to, normalize and, kind of also strip any gender from some of that language, it's going to remain a challenge. I mean, Joanie just said something. I was like, that's so interesting. Like tackling mental health. We don't say we're going to tackle cancer. We say we're going to tackle diabetes. But mental health, it makes it sound like this is something we can get rid of, and we'll just this is the thing. Let's just kind of talk about it in a way that's just like this one and done. So I think it was just very interesting, and I didn't mean to, but I wanted to like. The thought around that too, and even all of us have a responsibility around that, right? Like how do we start to change the language around mental health to allow athletes and sports to take it on as a wellness, as just part of their wellness agenda, right? Like just the way you have to work out and you have to stretch and you have to take your supplements. How do we build that into this entire thing to make it just that? It's about your wellness, and it's about your performance, and it's just about your overall being, in a good place as a human to do your best every day. And then there's a diversity issue in that as well, right? Like there is an inclusion issue in that as well. And I'll pause there, but as I was listening, I was like, oh my God, here it is.
I love that, and I'm really, really grateful and happy that you mentioned it, because I didn't even catch myself when I was saying those sorts of things. And you're right, in terms of normalizing this, we also have to have kind of, be using the same language, or have an even understanding of what that really means, because you're absolutely right. And it's interesting where, you talk about athletes working with a sports psychologist. There's kind of a bit of, that sounds kind of, there's a bit of cachet around that. It's like, oh my God, that's so cool. You must be really good if you have a sports psychologist in your corner.
Right. And it's tied to improving your competitiveness, not necessarily improving your wellness.
Exactly. Which is that is eye-opening for me. And I'm thinking about Iga Swiatek when she was talking about her own experience, and I have to paraphrase here, but she was saying that one of the things that really helped her do, having somebody in her team to do that, was when she won the French Open last year, there were so many different responsibilities that she didn't know how to deal with. They were completely unexpected. And she said part of having that person on her team allowed her to understand, okay, this is how I learn this. This is new for me, which all is part and parcel of your wellness, right? Your approach to wellness, your mental approach, your mental capacity, and that kind of thing. So that's really, really eye-opening for me. Closing comments. This has been such a fantastic discussion, and I'm so happy that that I managed to get all three of you on this call to have the discussion. But would love to get some closing comments from each of you in terms of anything that we talked about. Tips and tricks for anyone listening about how to deal with mental health, about how to educate themselves about mental health, or anything that comes to mind in terms of what you would like to see change as we go through this year of reliving and come out of it. What closing thoughts might you have? And Chloe, I will come to you first.
Renee, that was a word. My face was props to you. I was like, wow, because the stigma around language, we could have had a whole nother conference. What do I, it takes one. I think that's in my head, that's what keeps going around, is it takes one, and it takes one association to actually be the starter of this conversation, whether that's collaboratively or someone really, says that we're going to do this with responsibility and true accountability to talk about wellness and abundance. Because again, just like you were saying, Renee, the time that's scheduled in for downtime, we always make sure that that's in there, and wellness is a big part of that. I guess I want to leave on a point that I was talking about the other day. Her name's Dr. Zaina Ratti, and she's a psychologist, therapist. She says she no longer talks about self-care, she talks about self-compassion, because self-care is the assumption that it's fiscal and it's a thing that you can buy, and not actually a way in which you think about yourself, take time for yourself. So I think, again, when we talk about language and a devolution, but also a reclaiming, that in this time moving forward, it's how do we think about ourselves compassionately and make space for each other, but also recognize that if we don't continue to have these conversations in abundance in the mainstream, we will never utilize mental health for what it really is. And for me, it's a superpower.
Yeah.
I love that for every struggle that I've gone through, I know more about myself than most people will know about themselves. My emotional intelligence is profound, and sometimes it scares the hell out of me. But the way that it allows me to connect with people is something that I wouldn't change for the world. So there is strength in the things that we don't know and the things that scare us. So I think it's our duty to continue to have these conversations, and especially in sport that brings so much joy personally and competitively.
I love
have to
that.
keep each other whole.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Chloe. Self-care, self-compassion instead of self-care. I love that. And really kind of activating our superpower. That's brilliant. Thank you, Renee.
Thought I kind of did my drop the mic, but now we're gonna come back. Okay.
You kind of did, actually. Now you're on the hook to like drop it a second time.
Okay. I think one of the things that we didn't deep dive in just by virtue of time, and I just wanted to touch base on, like, when we think about sports, and Chloe talked about the accountability, right? Where does the accountability lie? And I think I thought about that a lot, because as mentioned, we're reliving this. We're going to continue to relive this for a long time. And I often find that the burden is often put on, the marginalized communities or the victims or the representations they're in. It's like, even if you look at this panel and who's hosting this panel, right? And I think when we start to think about the accountability around these topics, whether it's sports or community, whoever you want, I think we have to really, push ourselves and others to that allyship model. Who are the allies in this space? Because, and Shiv, you and I have talked about this a lot. We have these conversations, we have this panel, and most of the time we're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
The people who attend, the people who participate have already bought into it, right?
Yeah.
So how do we spread the accountability so that the reliving doesn't continue to be so traumatic, and it also doesn't contribute to additional fatigue, and it doesn't stall the process of change? We have to find, you know, pull those allies in. And I think this is the year of allyship, right? We've seen a lot of people put their hands up, whether individuals or to corporations, to sports leagues, and those allies have to, you know, whether they're fans or the community folks and or athletes who may not be affected by some of these things, they have to continue to talk about it, and they have to continue to say it's not enough. It cannot always be the persons on the receiving end of these experiences and these challenges having the onus of responsibility exclusively to institute and push through these changes. And that is why the change remains slow, because it's always the receive. I think for me, as we talk about compassion, to allies of the community, people that pass out without feeling marginalized, without feeling different, or creating an environment that's too scary, whether it's talking about George Floyd or racial injustice and systemic inequities, you know, to be more part of the partnership in this conversation. So for me, I think that's what I've been mulling over. So I hope for all the people that are listening to this, share this information, share these conversations with, you know, others, and have conversations amongst yourselves and challenge people to think about this differently, or not. But at least if they start the conversation and you start to get people to listen, it is a beginning at a minimum. And then the things like the guy from the French Federation, you know, the Tennis Federation, that willful ignorance can no longer be an excuse that they continue to rely on. So that would be my thing. Allies continue to kind of pull allies forward, you know, push allies to have more ownership in this conversation, and let's relieve the pressure on the folks that are receiving or living these challenges on a day-to-day.
Love it, love it. And through that, actually hold more people accountable, right? You know, interesting accountability perspective. Thank you, that's great. Joanie, final comments from you.
I don't know if I can add to those two. It's like, I dropped the mic just there. No, I mean, one of the things is that the fear that has come out of everything recently for me, that I don't ever want to be in this position again. You know, Black Lives Matter keeps coming up every 10, 15 years or, you know, and nothing gets done. I'm done at the time where I'm not going to say anything anymore. So part of it is that continuing to have the strength to speak up for my community as a whole, and that would be what I would do. But I would also expect, my expectations are higher as well. So I have a greater expectation of the Federation of Gay Games as the organization which I lead, that they're going to do more. And I'm hoping that through that would then create more leaders. I can do that in London with Out for Sport, because I'm involved with them and they're doing a lot. They done a lot over COVID around well-being. Was one of their major Zoom that they did with their membership. So it's just for us as an organization, ensuring that our member organizations are doing the right thing, because we're a global organization. So we have a starting point that we could do. So in some ways it's about leading by example. But as a Black woman, I know I'm not always going to do it. I'm very good at delegating. So I would be delegating out to the white male men in our group who have the resources to get out there and do things, to say, you know, now you've got to start doing it. And, you know, I feel I have a platform now, because it is very much in your face everywhere what's happening for our community. And if we don't speak up now, we're just going to end up with everything's just going to fade away. And in another 10 years, we're going to have a big eruption where everybody's going to come. It's going to be like it's just for the first time. That for me, I'm keeping my level of anger here. because the moment I let it slip, then the moment I'm letting not just myself down, but my community down. So if I'm doing as much as I can, my expectations are high. So it is what we're saying. We have to keep our expectations high.
Yeah.
Even though we know in the past it hasn't gone anywhere, but I have some belief that we're in a world that is more open because we're speaking to New York. How would we do this? In terms of that, the word can get out there at the same time, whereas before we'd have to wait
until exactly.
So everybody can hear something within the same 24 hours. We can hear the same thing.
Yeah,
and I think that is in a way of trying to get things out there. So it's still a struggle.
Yeah,
but you know, I think we're prepared to take that struggle on.
brilliant.
I'm
Thank
hoping that
you.
at some point I can pass the baton on. It's about being able to pass it on.
That's great. Thank you. We have to close it there. Thank you so much. So, you know, speak up, engage others, be accountable, practice self-compassion. Lots of really great, juicy information during the course of this panel. Renee Tirado, Chloe Davies, and Joanie Evans, thank you so much for being part of what I think is a really important discussion and what I am quite sure will not be the last discussion that we will have on the subject. So thank you so much and take care.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you, women.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.